not to go through life without having understood Kant's ethics. You might as well not have been born. But that's true of a lot of things too. It's true of Shakespeare and Bach and Wagner. And there isn't time to absorb it all, I agree. Nevertheless, this is one thing which has fallen to me to try to introduce you to. And I've thought about it a while, but I think that the only way to do it in the time available is to begin from Kant's general philosophy, the philosophy that's expounded in the Critique of Pure Reason, which is perhaps the most famous book of philosophy written in modern times, and which purports to set limits to rational inquiry. The Critique of Pure Reason, as the name of the book suggests, argues that we human beings, or we rational beings rather, have the ability to know the truth of our condition, but we also are tempted to think that we can know, as it were, beyond the truth of our condition, that we can reach beyond it and know the world as it is in itself, independently of our own point of view on it. And the Critique of Pure Reason is really devoted to undermining that illusion, saying that, arguing in other words, that we can indeed have knowledge of the world, but it is knowledge of the world from our perspective. In a way that seems obvious. But at the same time, we can only have this knowledge if we have the capacity to reason, and reason constantly tempts us towards the view that we can get beyond our perspective and see the world as a whole and as it is in itself. And that illusion, Kant argues, is responsible for many of the great works of metaphysics, and also for many of the religious thoughts that we have in our unreflective moments. So he starts off the Critique of Pure Reason by arguing that we do indeed have knowledge. We have this knowledge because we have understanding, but understanding depends upon experience. And our experience can produce knowledge only if it is organized in a certain way. And he argues that we organize our experience partly by situating it in space and time, and partly by bringing it under concepts, conceptualizing things. And these concepts are the primary concepts we grasp independently of experience. Okay, we can understand our experience because we apply concepts to it, but the concepts themselves do not result from experience, at least the fundamental ones among them. They are presupposed by experience. They are the concepts that we must have if we are to make sense of our experience at all. So in that case, they can't be derived from experience. They are what he calls a priori concepts. And when we have applied concepts to our experience, we gain knowledge of the world, and the knowledge that comes to us through formulating our experience in the form of propositions that can be true or false. But this knowledge that we have of the world shows us the world as a phenomenon, but not as what he calls a noumenon. A phenomenon is something revealed to the senses. A noumenon is a purely intellectual object, something that can be thought, but which can't be experienced. And his argument is essentially that we can only know the world as phenomenon and not as noumenon. He has another language for putting this, which is perhaps more pellucid to us now. He argues that we can know the world empirically, and we can know empirical truths, say truths that can be confirmed by experience, but we can't have knowledge of the transcendental, that which transcends experience. And he has a name for this thing that transcends experience. The name is the thing in itself. Objects are entities that are conceived independently of our own point of view on them. And his argument is that we can get just so far in our knowledge of the world, organizing it according to scientific categories and space and time, but we can't get beyond that to know the world as a transcendental object, an object that transcends experience. But now, that probably doesn't make any sense to you, or did it? Yeah? Okay, that's a summary of the Critique of Pure Reason in 5 minutes. settled in your mind, it enables me to give an account of what the principal question that we're dealing with today might be. It starts from the problem, as you might put it, the problem of the subject. Given that picture of the world, where am I? Where am I in all that? You can imagine a thought experiment. Imagine a perfect system of scientific inquiry, which gave you an account of all the laws of nature, and which also gave you a description of all the fundamental particles of the universe. So it described everything that there is. And you are looking at this, this description, and you say, this is the whole world. You still have a question, which of the things in this world is me? How would you answer that question? Of course, you can find perhaps a description of a particular human body in it, but what makes that body your body? Where are you in all this? The scientific description doesn't mention any particular point of view, does it? That's the whole point of science, to escape from your point of view and describe the world in something like a perspectiveless way. But even in Kant's vision of the world as a phenomenal realm, a realm of objects of experience, there still is an equivalent of the same question. Where in that realm am I? I'm not an object in the phenomenal world. I'm not a piece of furniture. I'm not something that I can come across in space and time. And one reason for saying that is, of course, that I know things about myself which I could never know about an object. I know, for instance, that I have a pain in my foot at the moment, and that I'm thinking about the people in this room, and also wondering whether I'm going to manage to get through this lecture without making terrible howlers. Now, those three truths about me I know without having to look at anything in the empirical world, and I know that they are truths about one thing. There's only one thing that is involved in those three propositions about myself. So I know that I'm a unity of consciousness. That's how he puts it. But also, it's not a unity of consciousness of a kind that I could come across as I come across you. So where am I? It's as though I'm on the edge of the world. I am the thing that is processing all the information, but I'm not an object of its own processing. I am the thing that's thinking this world, but I'm not the thing that is thought in the world. So the self seems to exist on the edge of things. And yet if I didn't think of myself in this unified way, as a creature which has all these different mental states at one and the same time, then Kant thinks I couldn't really begin the enterprise of having any knowledge at all. So it's only because I am this unified self, which is the subject of experience, that I can have knowledge of objects at all. So that's another aspect of the critique of pure reason, which is vital to his thinking. And it's summarized in a phrase that he uses, the transcendental unity of apperception. That's a very it's a piece of jargon, but it's stuck in the philosophical dictionary. Apperception means self-consciousness, the term from Leibniz. Unity, you understand. Transcendental here has a very special meaning. It means that this unity of self-consciousness is presupposed in all my experience. If it weren't there, I couldn't have experience at all. So it's not something which I conclude. It's not a conclusion I come to. It's something which, as it were, transcends all my attempts to gain knowledge, partly because it's presupposed in all those attempts. So that's his vision of the subject, this thing on the edge of its world, which has knowledge of that world, but is not an item in the world. So is it something else? That's the great question. Descartes famously thought that the subject is therefore something else. It's not part of the material world at all. It's a different kind of object, a spiritual object. And Kant says of that argument that is completely wrong, that we must see the subject not as another kind of object, but as a point of view upon the world of objects. It's not an item in the world, but the thing that looks at the world, so to speak. So there isn't a thing called the self, yet it is, in another sense, that which I fundamentally am. Now, how do you make sense of that idea? You know, something which I fundamentally am, but which I can never come across as I come across you, or tables and chairs and so on. It's something which is on the edge of my world, in something like the way that the edge of my visual field is there. Something which I can't find in the world. If I try to turn around, as it were, and seize my own self, looking at things, then all I do is become, take up another point of view. I'm still in that point of view that I'm taking up. So I can never make myself an object of my own awareness. I'm always a subject of it. But now there's another aspect to this. Yeah, has that mystified you sufficiently? I mean, if you think about it, it's actually one of those thoughts which you probably had. You probably had it in the, those frightening moments in the bath when nothing seems to be before you except thinking. And you have thoughts like that. Yeah. Where in this world am I? And what happens to me if the world is taken away, and so on. Right, so Kant thought that there's another aspect to this this position that I occupy as a subject, and that is the aspect that he called transcendental freedom. Now, when I'm in this state of reflecting self-consciously on the world seems to lie before me as an open arena in which my actions are possible. But there lies before me a field of activity, and I always have to question what to do. Just as I have to question what to think, question what I'm feeling, and so on, I have this other, really much more interesting question: what to do about it? Now, maybe there are people who have a sufficient moral indolence that they never ask that question. But most of you must have asked it, otherwise you'd never have got here in the first place. There was some existential crisis which persuaded you that you really had to attend one of Claire Fox's subject yourself to the kind of things that occur there. Even if it was a mistake, nevertheless it was a mistake that you made, and nobody else. So at a certain stage you were free to make it. The question, it was open to you to do it or not. And the question is, how do you answer that question? Here Kant said, we do find, again, that reason is involved, but this is a legitimate use of reason. Remember, in my 5-minute summary of the Critique of Pure Reason, he argued that the use of reason to try to understand the world from no point of view is an illegitimate use. And he tries to show that it will always end in contradiction. But he says there is a legitimate use of reason, which is the practical use, the use that we make of it when we answer the question, what shall I do? And this question is essentially addressed to the subject. That's why this is part of our position as subjects in the world of objects. That question only arises in the first person case. It only arises for me, rather, in the first person case. What shall I do? And it's addressed to me as an individual. Now, of course, I don't only see myself as an individual chooser. I have another vision of myself. I also see myself as part of nature. I'm a human being like you, and as a part of nature, I have a body, a biology. I'm bound by the laws of nature, and all kinds of things go on in me of which I have no knowledge. They're going on at this moment. And maybe you could have better knowledge of them than I have. For instance, you might be a doctor who's been studying my symptoms and saying, yes, indeed, he's got perhaps the first stages of Parkinson's or whatever. So you might actually know more about me than I do just by looking at me. Because that kind of knowledge is knowledge of me as an object, not as a subject. But we do distinguish these two different visions that we have of ourselves. And you can see what Kant has in mind if you contrast different kinds of statement about your own future. Suppose someone asks you, what are you going to do tonight at the party? Are you going to get drunk again? Or not? And you could reply by saying, well, you know, looking at my past conduct, it does seem pretty likely. But that's like predicting something, and I'm no better at predicting things in that respect than you are. So I'm seeing myself as part of nature, governed by causal laws. But I could also say to you in reply, well, actually, you think I'm going to get drunk because I'm a weak character. But actually, I've decided to get drunk in order to show my strength. So I made a decision to do so. And you might say, well, why on earth do that? And I might reply, well, you know, I'm always being nagged about it by you, but I'm now going to do it in a complete defiance of you, just to show you've got to take me seriously. Now, I've given you reasons. I'm not justifying a prediction as I would in any kind of scientific inquiry. I've given myself reasons for action. They're not very good reasons, but they support a decision. So can you see the contrast between these two cases? We're always making this contrast, actually, between those matters about which we regard ourselves simply as objects among others, and therefore we predict what we're going to do and try and understand ourselves scientifically, and those matters where we give up on the whole idea of prediction and seeing ourselves in this scientific way, and actually take charge of things. Say, look, you know, I'm going to do this, and I make a decision, and I give myself reasons for it. And Kant's thought was that this division is absolutely fundamental to our condition and corresponds to this division between object and subject. I can see myself as an object swept along by the laws of nature just like everything else, but I can also step back from that and say, no, I'm not just that, I am a subject, I am an I, something which has a privileged perspective on its own world and which can take charge of that world by taking decisions. And when I take decisions, I'm guided not by my own bodily processes, but by my will. And my will is answerable to reason, not to science. And that is a very important observation, which you may think needs a bit of proof, but nevertheless it corresponds to our way of actually being in the world. We wouldn't be able to find our way around the world, and especially find our way around human relations, if we didn't have this stance towards the world of taking responsibility for the outcome of our own choices and basing them in our reasons. Right, so this is where Kant's morality begins. He says that in that case, we recognize that we as subjects can act in obedience to reason, and in doing so, we're not acting or not behaving as mere objects do, but we are the originators of our own actions. And when I have a reason for doing something and then decide to do it, I have originated my own action. I have obeyed reason, and I can only do that because I am free to do so. I have, as it were, asserted my freedom in the realm of nature. Now, how is this possible? How is it possible for me to be an object among objects and still free? Kant has a very interesting thought in response to that. He says that actually the understanding, which, in other words, our understanding of the world as it is, as a system of causal laws and so on, the understanding can't actually grasp this. But we don't need to grasp it because we know it is true independently. Our reason tells us that it is true. Our reason tells us that we have freedom. And we know this with the same kind of certainty that we know that, that this thing that I gesture to has now got a pain in its foot. It is not something that I need to have evidence for. It is something that's given to me with my self-knowledge. This certainty that I am free, but the understanding stops at the threshold of this certainty. and can't make sense of it. But that doesn't matter. Why should one be able to make sense of everything? And Kant's trying to suggest that this is one of those places where, in fact, there couldn't be such a thing as making sense of it. It has to be accepted for what it is and how it presents itself. Well, that's something perhaps to go back to. But he thinks that from this thought he can derive a commonsensical morality that we all instinctively accept anyway. All rational beings accept it. The first point that he wants to emphasize is that when we listen to reason, we are listening to something which is law-like, something which gives us laws for justifying our action. And these laws come to us as necessary. They seem to be things that we cannot but act upon. And suppose somebody says to you, his example, that if you do a certain thing, you will gain a great deal of pleasure. You know, there's a wonderful feast awaiting you in the next room. But of course, you'll have to pay for this by being savagely beaten afterwards. Most of you say, well, in that case, I won't do it. You balance the good and evil against itself, or the cost and benefit against itself in all your ordinary practical reasonings. But when it comes to morality, we have a different kind of prospect confronting this. If somebody said to you that here you have a decision to make, you must betray your friend or tell some devastating lie or whatever, otherwise you're going to be beaten in a thrash in some terrible way. You might say, well, look, I'm a weak person, I will betray my friend, but you'll know that you've been doing wrong. It wouldn't be a question of balancing the costs and the benefits here. You might be persuaded by the threat to do something like betray your friend or engage in some equivalent immorality, but it will always weigh upon you as something that you ought to have done. You can't just cancel it out by a calculation. And this thought is what Kant tried to develop into a complete system of morality. That when it comes to moral thinking, we are confronted with absolute and necessary laws which bind us irrespective of what we want and irrespective of any of our self-interested calculations. And most people, when they think about it, recognize that this is true. Of course, we always try to slip out of our moral obligations and say, well, they're not really obligations. We try and rewrite them so that they don't have quite the force that we thought they had. But once they are before us and accepted as moral laws or moral commandments, then we recognize that there's no getting out of them. To go against them is possible, of course, because we are free beings. But in doing so, we are also committing a crime or putting ourselves in the wrong position vis-à-vis ourselves. So this peculiar feature of the moral law, that it is necessary, is something which he wanted to explain. And his thought was, it's necessary because it is indeed reason that leads us to it. And all the things that reason leads us to are necessary and not universal necessary matters rather than merely contingent and empirical. To explain this, he made a famous distinction between categorical and hypothetical imperatives, which again is very familiar from your ordinary reasoning. If I say to you, if you want to enjoy yourself this evening, then you should go for a walk around the lake. That is a piece of advice which has weight for you only to the extent that you accept that you want to enjoy yourself. The if makes it into a hypothetical imperative. It's telling you to do something only on a certain condition. But, Kant says, moral imperatives are not like that. They are all categorical. They say you ought to do something. Not if you want X or Y you ought to do it, but you just ought to do it. It has a kind of absolute and incontrovertible character, and that is what we need to explain. How is it that we, rational beings, can constantly come up against these strange imperatives which don't refer to our desires or our interests or anything else? They just stand there immovably in our worldview, as it were, telling us what we must do or what we can't do, without our being able to do anything about it except simply accept them. Well, not everybody does accept them, of course, but Kant thinks that, in fact, all rational beings, if they open their minds to this, will be led in the direction that he recommends. And this is the direction that he calls that of the categorical imperative. Now, he imagines the following thought. You are faced with the question, what to do? And you know you have a choice. You can go one of two ways. And if you are faced with that question, the first thing that you ask yourself is what should be the maxim governing my action? What should be the principle governing my action? The principle that my reason would be able to accept, so that it would be justified in my eyes. And we always do this when we're thinking about some serious decision. We think of what the principle would be upon which we take the decision. Simply to take it on no principle at all, like tossing a coin or whatever, is to avoid the rational choice. But of course we don't really avoid it, even by doing that. But to make a choice genuinely rational, and one from which we're genuinely responsible, and in which our freedom is fully exercised, we must have the principle through which we can rationalize it. So what form should this principle take? Kant says, well, if it is going to be a genuinely rational principle, it must appeal to reason alone, not to my special conditions. It shouldn't refer just to my interests or my desires, because then it would just be a hypothetical imperative. If I didn't have those interests or those desires, then the principle wouldn't have any weight for me. If it's to have the proper weight for me as a truly rational principle, so it's reason alone motivating me, then it must be, as it were, abstracted from all my individuating conditions, all the conditions that make me different from you. In other words, it must be a principle that I could offer to you too, equally, in the same predicament as me. It must be a maxim that I can will as a law for all rational beings. That's what he says, to summarize his categorical imperative. This is how he thinks morality must work if it is to perform its function of presenting these categorical imperatives. It must be founded upon a law or maxims that I can will for others as well as myself. I can will them as laws that bind people universally. And he thinks that's just a philosophical way of saying something which is also said by the great religions, at least by Christianity, Islam and Judaism, namely that we should act that we should do unto others as we would have them do unto ourselves. Right? That we should, in other words, the golden rule that most religious people feel they're obliged to follow. Not to make exceptions in your own case. Always to act upon that principle which you could recommend to another. Now Kant thinks that once you've started thinking in that way, other principles follow, as it were, like a shadow behind this one. Two in particular are very important. Since we have to think in terms of reason being a motive for all of us, this means that we must respect reason in all of us. We mustn't just regard other human beings as though they were animals or instruments for our purpose. We must regard them as rational beings too, and that means respecting them in a certain way, respecting them as rational beings, offering them reasons to do what we want them to do, rather than just compelling them to do so. Right? So this is something that is incumbent upon us as rational beings. In other words, that we don't try to force people to do things. We reason with them and see if they can accept our reasons. And if they can't, they might persuade us. So that's how we should deal with each other, not as mere objects or mere instruments, but as rational beings. And he put this in a very poetic way. He said that the categorical imperative also tells us that we should treat rational beings, in ourselves as well as in others, as ends and not as means only. It's a very poignant way of putting it, because he never really tells us what it is to treat someone as an end, but we know what it is to treat someone as a means. Slavery, rape, murder, robbery, etc. All are very transparently ways of treating people as mere objects for our own use. But what is it to treat them as an end? He left that question in the air, and it has its poetic reverberation has been felt down the centuries since. He also thought that the categorical imperative could be formulated in another way, in terms of what he called a kingdom of ends, another poetic expression, that we should act as though the maxim governing action were a law of nature in a kingdom of ends. In other words, as though we should act as though our principles could be used to lay down the legislation for an ideal world. We should always act as though our principles could really serve as ideals in some perfect world. All these are just three ways in which he formulates the categorical imperative, but he believed, and I think he was right, that they correspond to intuitions that we all have. We all have them, at least when we're being serious with each other, which is not very often. But in those vital conversations on the edge of divorce, you will find yourself using just these principles. And with any luck, you'll come back from that edge as a result. That's what Kant would say anyway. So, now, I guess I've got a few more minutes. Is it okay so far? Yes, right, okay. Then I can move on from Kant a little bit. Just one last direct thought about him. His view is that this system of morality would, first of all, corresponds to the moral thinking of all ordinary decent people anyway. They don't necessarily formulate it in this philosophical way, but it's there in their thinking and guiding them insofar as they are serious beings, because that's what freedom consists in. But he also believed that all of morality depends upon the exercise of the will. And the will is the most important feature of the human being, to which we refer whenever we're making moral judgments. He even says that there is nothing absolutely good in this world or out of it, save a good will. He says that's what makes the difference between a good person and a bad person. Somebody could have all the benefits that we can imagine in the form of wealth and status and looks and so on, but if he has not a good will with it, this makes him so much the worse. And likewise, he could lack all those benefits, but having a good will, that would be enough to make him a good person that he is. Now, so the will, however, can be corrupted. And Kant has a very interesting thought about this. He says that the really good will is what he calls autonomous. It's a will which wills its own actions as a law for itself. Let's say, rather, it wills its own actions according to law. It finds its motive within itself. And that's what happens when we consult the categorical imperative. We're finding the motive of the will, within within pure practical reason. But a will becomes corrupted when it becomes, as he puts it, heteronymous. That's to say, instead of being its own law, it takes its law from something else. In particular, from appetite, from the appetites of the body, or from the ambitions and interests which don't have any moral force. And you can see the difference here, he thinks, if you contrast the behaviour of a shopkeeper who, out of self-interest, is always honest with his customers. He knows that if he's not honest, they're not going to come back. So it's in his interest to be honest. That is somebody who is not acting from the moral law. He's simply acting in accordance with the moral law. His will is actually governed by his own self-interest rather than by morality. The shopkeeper, however, who behaves honestly to his customers, even in a time when of crisis, when of course that he's being cheated by them, but nevertheless feels that he has no option but to treat them honestly, because that's what the moral law requires. He is somebody who is acting autonomously. His will is autonomous and not governed by any interest outside itself. He is the truly moral person, the one who is acting from the moral law rather than merely in accordance with it. We know this distinction in our everyday life too. It's a distinction between morality and legality. You know, we all of us obey the law because it's in our interest to do so. Some of us would possibly obey the law even if it weren't in our interest to do so. But that's where the real test lies, isn't it? How you behave when the Nazis or the communists take over. What are you going to do then when it's no longer in your interest to obey the moral laws which you feel are binding on you? Right, now where does this leave us then? I've got a few minutes. I want to say something about what the relevance of Kant is to us today. But obviously I've been engaging in a certain amount of special pleading. I haven't allowed him to appear as an 18th century eccentric living in Königsberg. I've presented him very much as though he were a member of this audience, although slightly more articulate. And that's how I'd like you to think of him. He's somebody who did actually formulate many of the ideas which govern the modern world, or govern the decent people in the modern world, let's say, rather than those who are interested only in power relations. He made these important distinctions between the subject and the object. He argued that, that we are all subjects and are also all objects, but the subject is not something other than the object. It's like a way of seeing the object. And you can see what he had in mind if you think of a picture, a portrait in oils of somebody there, of Kant. You know, it consists of various pigments spread upon a canvas, but you see in it the face of the philosopher. But the face of the philosopher appears to you there not because it's something else. It's not something other than those pigments on the canvas. It's just something that you're seeing in a completely different way. You're seeing it under the aspect of the person and the aspect of freedom. And that's something like that goes on when in your own life. You can see yourself as your doctor sees you on the operating table. You know, as that complicated object which is being getting through things from cradle to grave. Or you can see that yourself in the way that you do when you're making these fundamental choices, in which case you're seeing yourself as a subject, and seeing yourself in a completely different way, so that you're, as it were, taking up position on the edge of things, and not in the middle of them. Do you see that? I mean, I know it's only a metaphor, but that's the kind of thing he's trying to say. And it comes out in the distinction I made already between predicting and deciding, between explaining something, as the doctor does, and justifying it through reasons. These distinctions are absolutely fundamental to us, and they are connected with another distinction between the animal and the person. And Kant is famous really for using this concept of the person to define what it was that he was trying to say. He was trying to put across the idea that a modern morality is a morality of persons. We're seeing each other as persons, taking each other seriously as persons. That means not treating each other as animals, but giving each other that special position in each other's world which we reserve for the free being. So that behind this, there's a emerging a concept of the person which has entered all our moral and political thinking at least in European civilization ever since. Let me just finish with a few thoughts about this. A person is a thing that can refer to itself in the first person case. You know, it's something like you and me, which can say I of itself. And in doing so, take up this position on the edge of things that I've been talking about. Such a creature can engage in special kinds of relation that occurs between an I and a you. The I and you relation is something that's absolutely familiar to you, and you know it, and not just through the way you talk to each other, but also the way you look at each other, the gestures you make towards each other, and the fact that when you're confronted with another person, you're automatically put in a position of accountability. That person doesn't stand before you as an object does, he stands before you as another subject, and you have to account to yourself for him. You can't just knock him over without giving reason, and nor can you simply ignore what he says or what he does without trying in some way to give him a satisfactory view of why you are doing so. So there arises between persons this kind of continuous dialogue through which they engage with each other, try to alter each other's conduct through reasoning rather than through force, and through which they allocate to each other a kind of individual space, a space which each of them occupies, from which he addresses the world. And this space is what we summarize in the concept of a right. You know, there is all of us have rights. That's a sphere of interest which cannot be invaded without being wrong. You have a right a free movement, which I can't prevent you from doing without invading your rights and therefore wronging you. And we think in these terms in all our everyday dealings, and also in our political dealings too, that there are certain things that you can't do to people because they are persons. Not because it might be in their interests to do it. You might think that it really would be useful to pick this person up and throw it into the pond. But you can't do it because he's a person. And our lives are full of these interdictions, which create around each of us a wall of protection which can't be breached without our consent. And you can see why this emerges, isn't it? That the whole point of having rights is that it means that when we do have relations with each other, they are based on consent and not on force. So what has emerged in the world of humanity, because it is a world of persons, is a community based upon consultation, consent, compromise, and so on. But all this depends upon our being able to take up that special perspective on the edge of things, which Kant called the transcendental unity of our perception. So the amazing thing is that all those technicalities that Kant puts before us actually have their, if you like, their political result in the kind of social order of which we are the beneficiaries. I know we all complain, everybody complains about the surrounding political order and the injustices of it and the fact that, and the grievances that you all have, otherwise you wouldn't be here, presumably, because you're looking for compensation for them. Nevertheless, we know very well that if we think about it, that we're incredibly lucky to live in a world where each of us does enjoy rights, which are not simply the rights laid down by law, but the rights that we all acknowledge in our dealings with each other, because we actually live in a community founded upon consent. And that is really what Kant was getting at, that the moral law is what makes this possible. The moral law makes it possible for us to live in communities, consensual communities. But it only does so because we obey it with the kind of absolute force that he, or it has for us the kind of absolute force that he says it has. Well, that's it.